Ethan Sterling always believed luxury was a birthright, not a privilege. But that morning, when the thundering helicopter blades faded into the sky and cold earth seeped through his designer shoes, reality struck with brutal clarity. No one was coming to save him. Manhattan's most pampered heir, a man who couldn't start a fire or identify drinkable water, now faced the wilderness as a silent enemy. The wind cut like a blade, hunger burned like fire, and the silence, that was the worst of all. Somewhere between fear, wounded pride, and the creeping darkness, Ethan realized a truth far more devastating than exile. His father hadn't punished him. He had given up on him. And there, alone among whispering pines, the city's spoiled prince understood, for the first time, that surviving would be far harder than living. The air in Ethan Sterling's sprawling Manhattan penthouse was thick with the cloying scent of artisanal truffle oil and the heavy perfume of casual indifference. Sunlight, filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, glinted off polished chrome and rare marble, illuminating a scene of almost absurd luxury. At 26, Ethan Sterling, heir apparent to Sterling Industries, reclined on a custom-made sofa upholstered in Italian leather, barely glancing up from the holographic display hovering above his wrist. He waved a dismissive hand at a trio of chefs, their pristine white uniforms a stark contrast to his silk loungewear. "No, Chef Antoine," he drawled, his voice laced with an habitual boredom that grated on anyone within earshot. "I said I was thinking of a Wagyu tartare. Not that I actually wanted it. It's a bit passé, isn't it?" Chef Antoine, a Michelin-starred culinary artist flown in from Paris, bowed his head, a flicker of exasperation crossing his impeccably calm face. "As you wish, Mr. Sterling. The private jet to St. Bart's is still on standby should your mood change." Ethan scoffed, a soft, mirthless sound. "Cancel it. The island is probably teeming with influencers by now. It's just not exclusive enough." He didn't bother to make eye contact as the chefs retreated, their footsteps barely audible on the plush carpets. His phone, a cutting-edge device encased in platinum, vibrated incessantly on the glass coffee table, displaying a flurry of notifications from high-stakes crypto investments he'd poured millions into but barely understood. The latest European sports car, a gleaming testament to his unearned status, sat in the climate-controlled garage 20 stories below, purchased on a whim after a particularly tedious afternoon. Every whim, every fleeting desire, had always been instantly gratified, leaving him adrift in a sea of material excess devoid of challenge or genuine purpose. He scrolled through a feed of curated social media, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he saw updates from friends equally insulated by inherited wealth. Life was a perpetual vacation, a game of accumulating more while expending less. The staff at Sterling Manor, his ancestral home upstate, and in his various city residences, often bore the brunt of his capricious moods, treated less like employees and more like invisible extensions of his will. He'd never had to lift a finger, never faced a consequence, never truly needed anything beyond what his name and his father's fortune could provide. His world was a gilded cage, though he saw it only as a playground, endless and without limits. A subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, a sudden stillness, signaled a presence far more formidable than any chef or social media update. Arthur Sterling, a man whose very name was synonymous with innovation and ruthless ambition, stood in the archway, a quiet force of nature in a bespoke suit. He was a self-made billionaire, a titan who had built Sterling Industries from a single audacious idea into a global empire. His silver hair was impeccably groomed, his gaze, usually sharp and calculating, now held a profound weight, a mixture of deep love and crushing disappointment as he surveyed his only son. Arthur's eyes lingered on the half-eaten gourmet pastries, the discarded designer clothes, the palpable air of entitlement that permeated every inch of Ethan's existence. Ethan... Arthur's voice was low, devoid of its usual corporate authority, yet it resonated with an undeniable power that cut through the penthouse's luxurious din. Ethan finally looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Dad, what's up? I thought you were in Tokyo negotiating that merger." Arthur stepped further into the room, his presence filling the vast space. "The merger can wait. We need to talk." He paused, his gaze fixed on his son, a man who had everything but understood nothing. "I've watched you, Ethan, for years. I've given you every opportunity, every comfort, every advantage a son could possibly dream of. And what have you done with it?" He gestured vaguely around the opulent apartment. "You've built a monument to your own idleness. You cancel private jets on a whim. You treat people like they're disposable. You invest in speculative nonsense without a shred of understanding. You are hollow, son." Ethan, unaccustomed to such direct confrontation, bristled. "Hollow? Dad, I'm living my best life. I'm managing my portfolio. I'm networking." Arthur cut him off, his voice hardening. "You're wasting your life. You're not managing anything, you're gambling. You're not networking, you're parading. And you are certainly not ready to inherit anything of substance. My legacy, our family's future, cannot rest on a foundation of such fragility." He took a deep breath, the decision clearly a painful one, yet unyielding. "I've made a choice, Ethan. A desperate one, perhaps, but one born of a profound love for you and a desperate need to save you from yourself." Ethan watched, a growing unease coiling in his stomach. He'd seen his father angry, he'd seen him disappointed, but never like this. So resolute, so utterly determined. "What are you talking about?" he asked, a hint of his usual arrogance still clinging to his tone. Arthur's eyes locked onto his son's, unwavering. "You are going away, Ethan, for 3 months. No phone, no internet, no credit cards, no staff. You will be completely cut off from everything you've ever known." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and final. "You are going to the Whispering Pines Preserve. You will live in the wilderness. You will learn to survive, to hunt, to build, to truly earn your existence. Only then, when you've proven you can stand on your own 2 feet, will you even begin to understand what it means to be a sterling. Only then will you earn your inheritance." Ethan's laughter, sharp and incredulous, cut through the sudden, suffocating silence. He pushed himself upright, his face contorted in disbelief. "The woods? Are you serious? Is this some kind of sick joke, Dad? Because it's not funny. I have a gala next week, and a crypto launch." His voice trailed off, his eyes wide with fury as he saw the unyielding resolve in his father's expression. Arthur Sterling was not joking. This was real. The hook was set, the unimaginable decree delivered. How would this spoiled heir, who couldn't even prepare his own coffee, possibly survive in the untamed wilderness? And what kind of desperate love, what profound fear for his son's future could drive a billionaire to such an extreme, almost unbelievable measure? The deafening thud of the helicopter blades faded into an unsettling silence, leaving Ethan Sterling standing alone on a patch of unfamiliar, damp earth. One moment, he was seething in the plush leather seat of a state-of-the-art chopper, convinced this was some twisted temporary prank orchestrated by his father. The next, he was unceremoniously nudged out by a stoic pilot who offered no farewell, just a curt nod before the machine lifted off, its powerful downdraft whipping leaves and dust around him. He watched its silhouette shrink against the vast, indifferent sky, until it was nothing more than a distant hum, then gone. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the roar, a thick blanket of isolation that pressed in on him from all sides. He surveyed his surroundings, a dense, ancient forest stretching endlessly in every direction. Whispering Pines Preserve, the pilot had called it. Towering pines, their needles forming a thick, dark canopy, loomed overhead, filtering the sunlight into dappled, shifting patterns. The air smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something wild and untamed. It was beautiful, he grudgingly admitted, but also overwhelmingly alien. His bespoke Italian suit, now rumpled and streaked with dirt, felt absurdly out of place, as did the expensive loafers sinking slightly into the soft ground. Beside him lay a military-grade backpack, the basic survival kit his father had so cruelly deemed sufficient, along with a laminated map he could barely decipher. 3 months. That was the time limit. 3 months to learn the true meaning of survival and earn his inheritance. It was a ridiculous, archaic concept, something out of a bad reality TV show. His initial indignation quickly morphed into a furious disbelief. This couldn't be real. Arthur Sterling, his father, might be many things, demanding, driven, occasionally overbearing, but he wasn't cruel. This was a test, yes, but surely there was a hidden camera crew, a safety net just out of sight. He reached for his pocket, pulling out his sleek satellite phone, a direct line to his private jet, his brokers, his pampered life. He tapped the screen, but the familiar Sterling Industries logo didn't appear. Instead, a stark message: no signal. He shook the phone as if it were a stubborn butler refusing service, then tried again. Nothing. He paced in a tight circle, his frustration mounting. This wasn't part of the game. This was genuine disconnection, a severance from the digital umbilical cord that had always kept him tethered to civilization. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was truly alone. As the afternoon waned, a chill began to creep through the dense foliage, carrying with it a dampness that seeped into his bones. His first priority, he decided with a flash of his old arrogance, would be a fire. He'd seen it done in movies, a simple flick of a lighter. He rummaged through the survival kit, pulling out a standard Bic lighter, a stark contrast to the custom-made solid gold one he usually carried. He gathered a few dry twigs and leaves, or what he thought were dry twigs and leaves, and crouched down, attempting to coax a flame. He flicked the lighter. A small flame sputtered, then died. He tried again and again, his thumb growing sore. The leaves, he quickly discovered, were too damp, the twigs too green. Smoke, acrid and thin, was all he managed, quickly dissipating into the cool air. The biting cold intensified, making his fingers stiff and clumsy. He cursed under his breath, a stream of expletives entirely unsuited to the serene wilderness. The sun, a fiery orange ball, dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and deep indigo before plunging the forest into a profound, oppressive darkness. The sounds of the woods, once merely unfamiliar, now became terrifying. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl, every unseen snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through him. He imagined predatory eyes watching him from the shadows, creatures he'd only ever seen in nature documentaries, now lurking just beyond his limited vision. He tried to construct some semblance of a shelter, pulling a flimsy tarp from the kit, but without proper tools or knowledge, it sagged miserably, offering little protection from the deepening chill. His first night in the wilderness was an ordeal of shivering, hunger, and a crushing, existential dread. He huddled beneath the inadequate tarp, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to conserve what little body heat he had. The cold seeped into him, chilling him to the core, a physical discomfort he had never before experienced. His stomach growled with a hunger that was raw and insistent, unlike the occasional pangs he'd felt between gourmet meals. He thought of the Sterling manor, the warmth of his king-sized bed, the array of midnight snacks a mere phone call away. Here, there was only the hard, damp ground, the biting wind, and the terrifying symphony of unseen nocturnal life. The vastness of the woods, stretching out for miles in every direction, felt less like a classroom and more like a tomb. The profound silence, broken only by the whispers of the wind through the pines and the calls of unseen creatures, was suffocating. His wealth, his influence, his entire identity built on luxury and convenience meant absolutely nothing here. He was just a human, a fragile, helpless thing, utterly at the mercy of an unforgiving environment. The arrogant facade he had worn his entire life, the one that had allowed him to dismiss staff and cancel jets on a whim, began to chip away, replaced by a creeping sense of vulnerability and a primal fear he'd never known. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the darkness and the fear, but they persisted, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. A profound injustice simmered within him, a bitter resentment towards his father. How could Arthur do this? How could he subject his only son to such raw, brutal discomfort? Ethan didn't understand the desperate love that had driven his father's decision, only the immediate, overwhelming suffering. Every detail, from the dampness of the ground beneath him to the phantom buzzing of insects in his ears, emphasized his discomfort and helplessness. He was a fish out of water, a prince in a pauper's clothes, and the harsh, unforgiving environment of Whispering Pines Preserve was just beginning its brutal lesson, setting the stage for an arduous journey he was utterly unprepared for. The biting cold of the Whispering Pines Preserve was merely the opening act for Ethan's true suffering. His first attempts at self-sufficiency were not just failures, they were catastrophic, each one a brutal testament to his privileged ignorance. He'd once watched a YouTube video on fly fishing, so he confidently approached a clear stream, a flimsy piece of twine from his kit serving as a line, a bent paperclip as a hook. He cast it with a flourish he imagined was professional, only to send every fish scattering in a frantic ripple of silver. He tried for hours, his hands growing numb, his frustration boiling over as the forest seemed to mock his every clumsy movement. Hunger, a sensation he'd only ever associated with choosing between gourmet restaurants, became a gnawing, acidic presence in his gut. He scoured the underbrush, remembering a vague image of berries from some nature documentary. He found a cluster of bright red ones, plump and inviting, and devoured them without a second thought. Within an hour, his stomach rebelled with furious spasms, leaving him doubled over, weak and disoriented, the bitter taste of regret and bile filling his mouth. He spent the rest of the day in a miserable haze, too sick to move, curled against a damp log, shivering uncontrollably. Building shelter proved equally impossible. He'd seen Boy Scouts erect tents in minutes. Ethan, however, managed to create a haphazard lean-to of branches and leaves that resembled a pile of discarded lumber more than a refuge. A sudden, relentless downpour, typical of the preserve, descended with a vengeance, tearing through his shoddy construction. Water poured over him, drenching his already threadbare clothes and extinguishing the meager, smoky fire he'd finally managed to coax from damp wood with his last dry matches. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, the chill seeping into his very bones. As night fell, a new terror emerged. A low growl, deep and guttural, echoed from the darkness just beyond his collapsed shelter. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a frantic drum. Then the distinct snap of a twig, followed by another, closer this time. He squinted into the gloom, catching the glint of two luminous eyes, too large and too close to be a deer. Panic seized him, a primal, visceral fear he'd never known. He scrambled to his feet, slipping on the wet leaves, and blindly crashed through the undergrowth, not caring where he went, only that he was away from whatever monstrous creature stalked him. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, collapsing behind a thick cluster of pines, trembling uncontrollably. That near disaster was a pivotal moment, shattering his remaining illusions of control and forcing him to confront his utter vulnerability. The gnawing hunger, the pervasive damp chill, The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, the sharp pain of thorns tearing at his skin, and the overwhelming fear of the unknown had begun to chip away at the gilded cage of his former life, leaving him raw and exposed. Just as Ethan reached his lowest point, truly believing he was going to die alone and forgotten in the vast, indifferent wilderness, a figure emerged from the dense foliage. She moved with an unsettling fluidity, her footsteps barely disturbing the fallen leaves, her presence almost ghost-like. Ilara Vance, a woman whose eyes held the keen, assessing gaze of a hawk, observed him with a mixture of suspicion and a hint of weary pity. She didn't offer immediate comfort, nor did she rush to his aid. Instead, her words cut through his remaining arrogance like a razor. "You're doing everything wrong," she stated, her voice low and gravelly yet clear. "Wasting energy, attracting trouble, and those berries? You're lucky you didn't eat enough to kill yourself." Ethan, usually quick to retort, found himself speechless. Her directness was a foreign concept to him. No one had ever spoken to him with such unvarnished truth. She pointed out his mistakes with a bluntness he'd never encountered, highlighting his wasteful habits, the scattered remnants of his failed fire, the discarded fishing line, the half-eaten poisonous berries. Ilara, a guardian of these woods, was initially wary, her posture taut, seeing him as just another entitled intruder from the world of money and concrete. Her offer of assistance, when it came, was reluctant and harsh, born less of charity and more of a pragmatic recognition of his desperate situation, and perhaps a sense of responsibility for the land he was currently blundering through. "If you want to live out here," she continued, gesturing broadly at the surrounding trees, "you'll earn every single breath. I won't hold your hand. You listen, you learn, or you starve." She tossed a small, smoked fish toward him, which he fumbled and dropped. "And you start by proving you can be useful." She then proceeded to show him, not tell him, how to properly set a snare for small game, demanding he mimic her precise movements until his blistered fingers ached with a new kind of pain. This wasn't a handout, it was a grueling apprenticeship, a stark contrast to the effortless luxury he once knew. While Ethan battled for every meager calorie and agonizing lesson in the wilderness, back in the gleaming towers of the city, Marcus Thorne subtly began to execute his long-planned scheme to usurp Arthur Sterling. Thorne, outwardly a picture of unwavering loyalty and ruthless efficiency, used Ethan's conspicuous absence as the perfect leverage. In hushed conversations over expensive scotch with board members, he planted insidious seeds of doubt, subtly suggesting that Arthur's judgment was faltering under the immense stress of his son's predicament. He hinted that Arthur's focus was fractured, his once sharp mind clouded by paternal concern, leaving Sterling Industries adrift and vulnerable in a cutthroat market. Thorne meticulously manipulated financial reports, exaggerating minor setbacks into looming crises and downplaying significant victories. He conjured an atmosphere of instability within Sterling Industries, all while publicly expressing deep, performative concern for both Arthur and the absent Ethan. "Poor Arthur," he'd sigh to a key investor over a power lunch at a high-end downtown steakhouse. "So worried about Ethan. It's truly taking a toll on him. One can only wonder if he's still got the steady hand we need at the helm during these challenging times." This insidious subplot ran parallel to Ethan's struggles, creating a growing sense of tension and foreboding. The biting cold of the Whispering Pines Preserve seemed to seep into Ethan's bones, a constant gnawing reminder of his helplessness. He was famished, every muscle ached, and the elaborate shelter he'd painstakingly constructed had just collapsed for the third time, leaving him shivering under a sudden, chilling drizzle. Despair, a feeling far more potent than any he'd ever known in the lap of luxury, began to settle in, heavy and suffocating. He curled into a tight ball, the damp earth beneath him offering no comfort, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest amplifying his crushing loneliness. just as the thought of simply lying down and giving up threatened to overwhelm him. A rustle in the dense undergrowth broke through his misery. A figure emerged, moving with an almost unnatural grace that contrasted sharply with Ethan's own clumsy attempts at navigating the wild. It was Ilara Vance, her eyes, sharp and intelligent, assessing him with a mixture of suspicion and a flicker of something akin to pity. She didn't offer a hand or a kind word. Instead, her voice, low and steady, cut through the damp air like a finely honed blade. "You're a mess, Sterling. You've wasted your energy, ignored the signs, and built a death trap instead of a shelter. You're trying to outsmart the woods instead of listening to them." Her blunt assessment, devoid of the fawning deference he was accustomed to, stung more than the cold. His initial instinct was to retort, to lash out with the arrogance that had been his shield for years, but the sheer exhaustion and the undeniable truth of her words silenced him. She pointed to the haphazard pile of branches he called a fire pit, then to the barely scratched earth where he'd tried to dig a water source. "You leave a trail a blind squirrel could follow, and you're polluting the very ground you're trying to survive on. This isn't Sterling Manor, boy. Here, every mistake costs you." Ilara was a guardian of these woods, her connection to the land palpable, almost visible in the way she moved and spoke. She saw him not as a billionaire's son, but as another privileged intruder, a burden on the fragile ecosystem she protected. Yet, beneath her wary exterior, a sense of responsibility, perhaps even a grudging recognition of his desperate situation, seemed to compel her. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering a harsh, uncompromising form of guidance. "I won't just hand you what you need," she stated, her gaze unwavering. "You want to eat? You'll earn it. You want shelter? You'll build it right. My time isn't free, and neither are the lessons this forest has to teach." She pointed to a patch of wild onions, then to a cluster of berries. "Those are edible. Those will kill you. Learn the difference, or you'll be another meal for the coyotes." Ethan, though still bristling at her tone, found himself listening. He watched as she demonstrated how to properly set a simple snare, her nimble fingers working with an efficiency that made his previous attempts seem like a child's game. The small portion of dried jerky she eventually shared with him, after making him gather and filter water for both of them, tasted like the finest meal he'd ever had, not because of its flavor, but because it was earned. This encounter introduced a potential ally, but one who would be a tough, uncompromising mentor, further emphasizing that his journey would be one of earned respect and hard-won lessons, not easy solutions. He was no longer just fighting the elements, he was fighting his own ingrained habits under the watchful, unforgiving eye of Ilara Vance. Meanwhile, back in the gleaming towers of New York City, Marcus Thorne was meticulously advancing his own insidious agenda. Outwardly, he remained Arthur Sterling's most loyal and efficient second-in-command, a pillar of corporate stability. But beneath the polished facade, Thorne was a predator, using Ethan's prolonged absence as the perfect opportunity to tighten his grip on Sterling Industries. He moved with a chilling precision, planting subtle seeds of doubt among the board members during discreet lunches and carefully choreographed meetings. "Arthur's under immense strain, of course," Thorne would lament, shaking his head with a show of profound concern. "His son's situation, it's weighing heavily on him. Perhaps his judgment isn't as sharp as it once was. We need steady hands on the wheel, especially now." Thorne manipulated financial reports with the finesse of an artist, subtly exaggerating minor market fluctuations into looming crises and presenting perfectly manageable setbacks as signs of an impending corporate collapse. He created an atmosphere of unease and instability within Sterling Industries, all while publicly expressing unwavering support for Arthur and deep concern for Ethan's well-being. My heart goes out to Arthur. He'd tell sympathetic board members. He's trying to do right by his boy, but the company, it suffers when the captain is distracted. This insidious subplot ran parallel to Ethan's struggles in the wild, creating a growing sense of tension and foreboding. The audience, privy to Thorne's machinations, watched with a sense of dread, knowing that Arthur, consumed by his desperate concern for Ethan and believing he was doing the right thing, was utterly vulnerable to Thorne's calculated betrayal. Thorne's actions weren't openly hostile yet. They were insidious and calculated, a slow, silent strangulation of Arthur's control, setting the stage for a corporate takeover that Ethan was completely unaware of. The stakes for the Sterling Empire, and indeed for Arthur's legacy, were rising dramatically, far beyond Ethan's personal transformation. Under Ilara's stern tutelage, Ethan's education in survival became a relentless, painful ordeal. She pushed him without mercy, demanding precision and effort that tested his physical and mental limits daily. He spent hours, his hands blistering and raw, trying to start a fire using a bow drill, a task that initially seemed impossible. "Faster, Sterling, more pressure. Do you want to freeze tonight or do you want to live?" She would bark, her words a constant goad. He chafed under her authority, his bruised ego struggling against the humbling reality of his incompetence. Yet the gnawing hunger and the pervasive discomfort of the wilderness slowly forced him to listen, to learn, and to obey. He learned to identify safe water sources, the subtle sheen of a clean spring versus the stagnant murk of a puddle. He purified it, drop by agonizing drop, through layers of sand and charcoal he'd painstakingly gathered. Ilara taught him how to track small game, deciphering the faint imprints of a rabbit or a squirrel in the forest floor. Miles away from the whispering pines and the damp forest floor, the polished chrome and glass towers of Sterling Industries hummed with a different kind of life, one fueled by ambition and calculated risk. Within the hushed, climate-controlled offices, the absence of Ethan Sterling was a topic of hushed whispers and knowing glances, a void that Marcus Thorne was expertly filling with his own calculated presence. Outwardly, Thorne was the picture of unwavering loyalty, a man whose every word and gesture conveyed deep concern for Arthur Sterling and his wayward son. He moved through the executive suites with an air of quiet efficiency, his suits impeccably tailored, his smile always reassuring, even as his eyes held a glint of something sharper, something far less benevolent. Thorne understood the delicate ecosystem of the corporate world, a landscape where perception often trumped reality. He began his subtle campaign by planting seeds of doubt among the Sterling Industries board members, highly influential individuals who valued stability and predictable returns above all else. During weekly executive briefings, Thorne would artfully weave in seemingly innocuous comments. "Arthur's focus has been understandably divided lately," he might remark, his voice laced with feigned empathy. "Given the challenges with Ethan, it's only natural for a father to be distracted." He never overtly criticized Arthur, but rather painted a picture of a man stretched too thin, a CEO whose personal turmoil was beginning to cast a shadow over the company's otherwise stellar performance. He'd suggest that while Arthur was undeniably a visionary, the sheer emotional toll of his son's situation might be compromising his legendary judgment. The financial reports, usually a source of pride for Arthur, became Thorne's next tool. He didn't outright fabricate numbers, for that would be too risky, too easily exposed. Instead, he subtly manipulated the narrative around them. Minor setbacks in emerging markets, usually brushed off as typical fluctuations, were presented with an exaggerated gravity, accompanied by a somber shake of his head. He'd highlight potential future risks with undue emphasis, creating a sense of impending doom where none truly existed. A dip in stock price, caused by broader market trends, would be framed as a direct consequence of uncertainty at the top, a veiled reference to Arthur's perceived emotional vulnerability. He always had a perfectly reasonable, albeit misleading, explanation for every statistic, delivered with a calm, authoritative tone that belied the insidious intent behind his words. An atmosphere of instability began to permeate Sterling Industries, a slow, creeping unease that Thorne fostered with meticulous care. He'd hold private, confidential conversations with key board members, expressing his deep, personal worry for Arthur. "He's a titan, of course," Thorne would confide, lowering his voice, "but even titans can buckle under the weight of personal burdens. The market, unfortunately, doesn't care for sentiment. It demands strong, unwavering leadership." He would then subtly pivot, offering solutions to the manufactured problems, solutions that invariably involved him taking on more responsibility, gaining more control. He positioned himself as the steady hand, the reliable anchor in a turbulent sea of Arthur's making, all while publicly maintaining a facade of absolute devotion to his mentor and friend. Arthur Sterling, a man who had built his empire from nothing, was indeed distracted. His mind was constantly adrift, picturing Ethan shivering in the cold, struggling with hunger, grappling with the profound loneliness of the wilderness. He agonized over his decision, replaying his son's furious face, questioning if he had pushed him too far. This gnawing paternal concern, a profound love mixed with a desperate hope for transformation, left him vulnerable, his usual razor-sharp corporate instincts dulled by worry. He saw the reports Thorne presented, heard the murmurs from the board, and while a faint alarm bell might ring in the back of his mind, he dismissed it as a natural consequence of his preoccupation. He believed Thorne was genuinely stepping up, a loyal second-in-command, easing his burden during a difficult time. The injustice of it all was a bitter pill for any observer to swallow. While Ethan was battling literal elements, confronting his own arrogance and learning the brutal demands of self-sufficiency, his father was being slowly, meticulously undermined by the very man he trusted most. Thorne's actions were not loud, aggressive attacks. They were subtle poisons, administered drop by drop, designed to slowly strangle Arthur's control without ever drawing overt suspicion. He was orchestrating a corporate takeover not with brute force, but with psychological warfare, leveraging Arthur's greatest weakness, his love for his son. This insidious subplot ran a chilling parallel to Ethan's struggles, creating a growing sense of tension and foreboding for the audience. The stakes were no longer just about Ethan's personal transformation. They were about the very future of Sterling Industries, an empire built on grit and ingenuity, now threatened by greed and betrayal. Each manipulated report, each whispered doubt, chipped away at Arthur's foundation, pushing his company closer to the brink. The audience, privy to Thorne's true intentions, felt a mounting dread, knowing that Arthur, blinded by paternal concern and believing he was doing the right thing for Ethan, was completely unaware of the viper he harbored in his inner circle. Thorne's calculated moves ensured that by the time Ethan might return, if he returned at all, the corporate landscape he once took for granted might be irrevocably altered, slipping from his family's grasp like sand through fingers. The threat was real, it was imminent, and it was entirely invisible to its primary victim. The biting chill of the Whispering Pines Preserve was a constant, unwelcome companion, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled comfort Ethan Sterling had once taken for granted. Under Ilara Vance's unyielding gaze, his education in the brutal curriculum of survival began, each lesson a fresh assault on his pampered sensibilities and a painful reminder of his profound ignorance. Ilara was no gentle tutor. Her methods were as raw and unforgiving as the wilderness itself. She spoke in clipped, direct sentences, her eyes missing nothing, her patience for his complaints non-existent. "You're wasting energy," she'd snap, watching him flail at a task. Think before you move, or the forest will punish you for your laziness. His first major challenge was water. Ilara led him to a murky stream, its surface dotted with debris. Ethan recoiled, remembering the bottled spring water, chilled and filtered, delivered to his Sterling Manor penthouse. "You expect me to drink that?" He'd scoffed, a familiar sneer on his lips. Ilara simply fixed him with a stare that promised no quarter. She showed him how to build a rudimentary filter from layered cloth, sand, and charcoal, then how to boil the collected water over a fire. The process was painstakingly slow, and the resulting liquid, though safe, still tasted faintly of earth and leaves, a far cry from the crisp, clean taste he was accustomed to. He'd gagged the first few times, but the gnawing thirst eventually forced him to swallow, the metallic tang of fear mixing with the water's wild essence. Building a fire, the most fundamental of all survival skills, proved to be an exercise in pure agony and frustration. Ilara insisted he learn the friction method, eschewing the convenience of matches or a lighter, items she confiscated immediately. Hour after hour, he knelt, meticulously preparing a fireboard and spindle, his fingers clumsy, his muscles aching. He'd rub the stick against the board, generating nothing but smoke and splinters, his hands quickly blistering, then bleeding. The pungent smell of burnt wood mingled with the acrid scent of his own sweat and growing despair. "Faster, but with control," Ilara would drone, never offering to help, only to critique. He wanted to scream, to throw the sticks into the undergrowth and give up, but the thought of another night shivering in the damp cold, his stomach rumbling, pushed him onward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a tiny ember glowed, a fragile spark of life that he nursed into a hesitant flame. The triumph was immense, a visceral surge of accomplishment that briefly eclipsed the throbbing pain in his palms. It wasn't a roaring bonfire, but it was his fire, born of his own effort. Tracking small game was another lesson in humility. Ethan, who once tracked stock market fluctuations on a dozen screens, found himself utterly blind to the subtle signs of the forest floor. Ilara taught him to read faint paw prints, broken twigs, disturbed moss, a language he slowly, grudgingly, began to decipher. He learned to move silently, to merge with the shadows, a skill that felt utterly alien to a man who had always announced his presence with expensive cars and designer cologne. Setting rudimentary traps was equally challenging. He fumbled with knots, misjudged angles, and repeatedly failed to entice any creature. Days would pass, his traps empty, his stomach emptier. Ilara would inspect his work, a faint frown creasing her brow. Too obvious. Too much human scent, the animals know. His pride, once an impenetrable shield, was now a tattered flag, constantly lowered by his repeated failures. Foraging for food was a minefield of potential disaster. Ilara drilled him on identifying edible plants, berries, and roots, warning him of the deadly consequences of a mistake. He learned to distinguish between the harmless wild garlic and its poisonous lookalikes, the nourishing wild berries from their toxic counterparts. Every mouthful was a gamble, a test of his memory and Ilara's instruction. Some of the edible roots tasted bitter. Some of the berries were tart, nothing like the sweet, perfectly ripe fruit flown in from exotic locales for his breakfast smoothies. He ate them anyway, the primal urge to survive overriding his ingrained pickiness. Every lesson was a struggle, a battle against his own ingrained entitlement and physical limitations. His muscles, once toned by personal trainers in state-of-the-art gyms, now ached with a deep, pervasive fatigue he'd never known. His hands, once soft and manicured, were rough, calloused and scarred. He chafed under Ilara's authority, often questioning her rationale, muttering under his breath about her harshness. "Why can't we just use a knife for that?" he'd complain, only to be met with a withering look. What if you lose it, city boy? You rely on what you have, not what you wish you had. But the raw reality of his hunger, the biting cold, and the sheer discomfort slowly, inexorably, forced him to listen. He had no choice but to absorb her knowledge, to internalize her methods. There were small, painful victories, moments that, despite the suffering, provided a flicker of hope. The first time he managed to build a fire from scratch, coaxing a flame from a tiny ember, the warmth spreading through his numb fingers, was a revelation. The day he finally caught a small fish in a trap he'd painstakingly crafted, the silver flash of its scales, a testament to his patience, felt like winning the lottery. He remembered the ease with which his personal chef prepared sushi, now finding profound satisfaction in a few ounces of wild-caught protein, and the shelter he'd built, a crude lean-to of branches and leaves, actually withstood a light rain shower, keeping him relatively dry as the drops hammered the forest canopy above. Each success was hard-won, accompanied by the physical pain of exertion, the mental fatigue of constant vigilance, and the humbling realization of his past ignorance. The sensory details of his new existence were overwhelming, the pungent smell of pine needles underfoot, the damp earth clinging to his clothes, the constant buzz of unseen insects, the sharp tang of wild berries on his tongue, the rough, abrasive feel of tree bark against his skin, and the persistent ache in his muscles that never truly faded. He learned to differentiate the rustle of a squirrel from the heavy tread of a larger animal, the distant hoot of an owl from the chilling cry of a coyote. The sounds of the wilderness, once terrifying and alien, were slowly becoming a familiar, if still intimidating, symphony. Ethan's ears, once deafened by the city's constant hum, were now acutely sensitive to the subtle shifts in the forest's rhythm. He could distinguish the rustle of a squirrel from the slither of a snake, the distant hoot of an owl from the whisper of the wind through the pines. And his eyes, no longer scanning only for immediate threats, began to truly observe the intricate tapestry of the whispering pines' preserve. Weeks of struggle had honed his senses, sharpening his focus beyond mere survival to an almost primal awareness of his surroundings. It was this newfound attunement that allowed him to notice the anomalies, the tiny imperfections in the natural order that would have been invisible to the entitled, oblivious Ethan Sterling of just a few months prior. One crisp morning, while foraging for wild onions near a babbling creek, a flash of something unnatural caught his eye. Tucked beneath a thick fern, barely visible, was a small, sleek object. It was made of a dark, matte polymer, not unlike the casing of a high-end drone, yet it was perfectly still, blending almost seamlessly with the shadows. He knelt, his heart giving an unexpected thump against his ribs, and carefully nudged it with a stick. It was a sophisticated, camouflaged camera, no bigger than his palm, with a tiny lens that seemed to stare back at him. This was not the kind of equipment Elara Vance would use, nor did it bear any resemblance to the rough, handmade tools of Old Man Silas. It felt utterly alien, a cold, hard piece of the modern world intruding on the pristine wilderness. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine, a sensation far colder than the morning air. His first, knee-jerk thought was that this must be part of his father's test. Arthur Sterling, always one for elaborate schemes, might have placed surveillance to monitor his progress, to ensure he wasn't cheating, but as he examined the camera more closely, its advanced design and covert placement suggested something far more insidious than a paternal check-in. The device wasn't merely observing, it felt like it was spying. The feeling gnawed at him, an unsettling prickle of unease that grew with each passing hour. Over the next few days, as he ventured deeper into the preserve to check his trap lines and search for new food sources, he began to see more. Faint, unusual tracks, too precise and too deliberate to be animal, appeared near a game trail he frequented. They weren't from hiking boots like Ilara's. These were heavy-duty, industrial soles, leaving impressions that spoke of purpose and weight. Then, tucked into the crevice of an ancient oak, he discovered a small, almost invisible piece of advanced communication gear. A tiny satellite uplink no larger than a deck of cards, clearly designed for remote, secure transmission. Its presence here, miles from any road or power source, was profoundly disturbing. The equipment felt out of place, not merely misplaced, but deliberately hidden, an unwelcome stain on the untouched landscape. He also started noticing subtle, oddly placed trail markers, small, reflective tags tied to branches at irregular intervals, leading off into denser, less traveled parts of the forest. They weren't the blazes of a park ranger or the natural indicators Ilara and Silas used. These markers had a corporate, almost standardized look to them, utterly devoid of the organic feel of the wilderness. Each discovery chipped away at his initial theory of a father's test, replacing it with a growing conviction that something genuinely sinister was unfolding in the preserve. The wilderness, he realized with a jolt, wasn't just a harsh teacher of nature. It was also a stage for hidden human activities, a dangerous game he hadn't known he was playing. The weight of these discoveries pressed down on him, a heavy burden that overshadowed his daily struggles for food and shelter. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. The next time he met Ilara at their agreed-upon rendezvous point by the Twin Falls, his usual complaints about his latest scraped knee or failed attempt at fishing were replaced by a tense urgency. He pulled the camouflaged camera from his pack, laying it carefully on a mossy rock between them. Ilara's eyes, usually sharp and assessing, narrowed as she picked up the device. Her fingers traced its smooth, cold casing, a frown deepening on her face. She didn't need an explanation. The object itself spoke volumes. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice low and tight, devoid of its usual sarcastic edge. Ethan recounted his findings, detailing the other pieces of equipment, the unusual tracks, and the strange trail markers. He spoke with a newfound clarity and precision, his words stripped of their former arrogance, reflecting the serious nature of his observations. He explained his initial thought that it might be his father's doing, but then expressed his growing fear that it was something far worse. Ilara listened intently, her grim expression confirming his suspicions. She returned the camera to him, her gaze fixed on the dense forest around them. "There have been whispers," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper herself. "Talk from Oakhaven, from the trappers and hunters who venture deep, outsiders. They've been seen on the fringes, poking around, asking questions about the land, about old mining claims." She paused, her jaw tightening. "Some say they're looking for timber, others for minerals, but they're not just looking, they're encroaching, quietly, systematically." Her words sent another jolt through Ethan. Illegal logging or mineral prospectors. The thought filled him with a cold dread. This wasn't just about his personal journey of transformation anymore. This was about the very land that had become his reluctant sanctuary, the home of Ilara and Silas, the heart of an ecosystem he was slowly learning to respect. The wilderness wasn't merely a backdrop to his struggle. It was now a vulnerable entity under threat, and he was unwittingly caught in the middle. The discovery added a new, far more dangerous layer to his exile, shifting his focus from purely personal survival to a growing awareness of external threats that felt disturbingly organized and powerful. He looked at the camouflage camera again, then at the vast, silent forest, and a chilling realization settled in his gut. The quiet struggle for his own survival was about to intersect with a much larger, darker conflict. The corporate world he thought he'd escaped seemed to be reaching its greedy tendrils even into the heart of Whispering Pines Preserve. The encroaching shadow of corporate greed, though momentarily pushed from his conscious thoughts, still lingered on the periphery of Ethan's awareness, as he continued to navigate the unforgiving terrain of Whispering Pines Preserve. Weeks blurred into a relentless cycle of physical exertion and mental fortitude under Ilara's unyielding tutelage. His muscles, once soft and accustomed to luxury, now ached with a deep, persistent burn, a constant reminder of every fallen tree he had cleared, every rock he had moved, every mile he had traversed. His hands, once manicured, were calloused and scarred, bearing witness to countless attempts at fire-starting, trap-setting, and shelter-building. Every fiber of his being was exhausted, yet there was a burgeoning resilience that he had never known before, a strength forged in the crucible of discomfort and necessity. One particularly cold morning, after several days of meager foraging and the dwindling remains of Ilara's shared provisions, a gnawing hunger settled deep in Ethan's gut, more profound than any he had experienced. It wasn't merely the physical craving for food. It was a primal urge, a demand from his very core to provide for himself. He looked at Ilara, her face etched with the wisdom of the wild, and saw an unspoken challenge in her eyes. It was time. He needed to hunt, not for sport, not for a lavish meal, but for survival, for proof that he was truly learning, truly capable. He spent the better part of a frigid afternoon tracking. Ilara had taught him the subtle language of the forest floor, the almost imperceptible indentation of a paw print in damp earth, the faint scuff of fur against a fallen log, the tiny scattered droppings that signaled a nearby burrow. He focused on the signs of a rabbit, a common but elusive creature in the preserve. His eyes, once oblivious to anything beyond a smartphone screen, now meticulously scanned the undergrowth, seeking out the slightest disturbance. He moved with a newfound stealth, his movements quieted by practice, his breath held to listen for the rustle of leaves or the distant thump of a wary animal. Hours crawled by, each minute a test of patience he never knew he possessed. He felt the sting of frustration as he lost a trail, the fleeting hope as he picked up another, the biting cold seeping into his bones. It was a meditative, grueling dance with nature, a far cry from the instantaneous gratification of his former life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he found a fresh set of tracks leading to a dense thicket. Recalling Ilara's precise instructions, he began to construct a snare. He carefully selected a flexible sapling, bending it into a spring-loaded mechanism, then meticulously fashioned a noose from braided plant fibers, camouflaging it with leaves and twigs. Every knot was tied with deliberate care, every placement calculated. He thought of the intricate algorithms he once dabbled in for crypto trading, realizing the profound difference between abstract calculations and the tangible life-or-death engineering of a simple trap. He set it near a well-used game trail, then retreated, settling downwind to wait, his heart thrumming with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The waiting was the hardest part, a battle against his own impatience, against the gnawing doubt that whispered he would fail. When he returned at dawn, the forest was still shrouded in a misty silence. His breath hitched as he approached the snare. There it was, a small, brown rabbit, caught. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. There was the undeniable surge of triumph, the sheer elation of success, a primal roar of victory echoing in his chest. But beneath it, a profound sadness, a heavy weight of responsibility. He had taken a life. He had seen countless animals prepared by chefs in his past, but this was different. This was his doing, his direct action. The rabbit's struggle was brief, its life extinguished with a swift, practiced motion that Ilara had demonstrated. The act was brutal, necessary, and utterly devoid of the romanticized notions of hunting he might have once held. It was survival, raw and unvarnished. With the rabbit in hand, Ethan returned to his makeshift camp. The next steps were equally daunting. Skinning the animal was a messy, Visceral task, its warmth still lingering, its small form still too real in his hands. He worked slowly, carefully, every cut precise, remembering Ilara's lessons on minimizing waste. The smell of fresh blood, the feel of fur and sinew were a world away from the sterile, plastic-wrapped meats he knew. He gutted it with a grim determination, pushing past his initial revulsion, understanding that this was the cost, the essential ritual of providing. He cleaned the meat as best he could, his hands stained, his mind focused on the task at hand. Then came the fire. He gathered kindling and tinder, carefully arranging them in a small teepee. His first attempts at building a friction fire had been humiliating failures, leaving him with blistered hands and a bruised ego. Now, with practiced ease, he worked the bow drill, the friction slowly creating a wisp of smoke, then a glowing ember. He carefully transferred it to the tinder bundle, blowing gently until a tiny flame flickered to life. The warmth was instant, a comforting embrace against the morning chill, and the crackle of burning wood filled the quiet clearing. It was a sound he had come to cherish, a symbol of safety and provision. He skewered the rabbit over the flames, turning it slowly. The aroma of roasting meat, initially foreign, soon became intoxicating. It was the most incredible smell he had ever encountered, far surpassing any Michelin-starred meal. As the fat dripped and sizzled, Ilara emerged from the trees, her presence as silent and natural as the forest itself. She watched him, her expression unreadable as always, but he sensed a subtle shift, an almost imperceptible softening around her eyes. He offered her a portion of the cooked rabbit, holding it out with the respect born of shared hardship. She took it, her gaze meeting his. For a long moment, she simply chewed, her eyes scanning his face. Then, slowly, deliberately, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, more impactful than any grand declaration. It was an acknowledgement of his effort, his tenacity, his growth. It was, for Ethan Sterling, the most profound validation he had ever received. The taste of the wild meat was earthy, lean, and utterly delicious, imbued with the satisfaction of his own labor. The earthy, lean, and utterly delicious taste of the wild meat, imbued with the profound satisfaction of his own labor, lingered in Ethan's memory. Yet, even as he savored that hard-won triumph, a world away, his father, Arthur Sterling, wrestled with a different kind of hunger, the gnawing anxiety of a father's love and the encroaching shadow of corporate treachery. Arthur sat in his sprawling Sterling Industries office, the panoramic view of the city skyline offering no solace. He appeared outwardly composed, a titan of industry, but his meticulously tailored suit felt like a straitjacket, and his internal world was a maelstrom of worry and self-doubt. He constantly reviewed the terms of Ethan's exile, each passing day a fresh torment, questioning if he had pushed his only son too far. The silence of his opulent office, once a sanctuary of power and ambition, now felt like a cold, echoing cage, amplifying his fears. Marcus Thorne, ever the loyal second-in-command, supplied Arthur with regular, carefully curated reports regarding Sterling Industries' performance. Thorne, a master manipulator, painted a picture of growing instability, subtly emphasizing the need for stronger, more decisive leadership. He highlighted minor setbacks, exaggerated market fluctuations, and whispered insinuations about Arthur's distraction due to his son's situation, all while maintaining an air of profound concern. Arthur, his mind clouded by paternal anguish, sensed a subtle shift in the corporate landscape, a gradual erosion of his authority, but he tragically attributed it to his own preoccupation with Ethan, believing his judgment was indeed faltering. He often found himself staring at old photographs of Ethan as a child, a simpler time when their bond felt unbreakable, a stark contrast to the chasm that now separated them. He confided in Eleanor, his trusted elderly secretary, her kind eyes reflecting his own unspoken fears. "I fear I might be losing both my son and everything I've built, Eleanor," he'd confessed one somber evening, his voice heavy with a vulnerability he rarely showed. The injustice of Thorne's betrayal was slowly strangling Arthur's empire, and he was too blinded by his desperate love and concern for Ethan to fully perceive it. Meanwhile, back in the Whispering Pines preserve, Ilara, observing Ethan's growing, albeit grudging competence, decided it was time for his ultimate test: extended solitude. She informed him that she needed to leave for a few days, to tend to urgent matters in Oakhaven and check on a distant trap line that required her immediate attention. To Ethan, this decision, though logically sound for his growth, felt like a cruel abandonment. He watched her disappear into the dense foliage, the silence that followed, amplifying his internal conflict. The days that stretched before him felt like an eternity. He faced new challenges alone. A sudden, unexpected thunderstorm that threatened to tear apart his meticulously constructed shelter, a scarcity of game that tested his hunting skills to their limit, and the chilling realization of just how truly isolated he was. The silence of the woods, once a terrifying void, now became a profound, almost spiritual presence, forcing him into an introspection he'd never known. He confronted his deepest fears, his past mistakes, and the true complex meaning of his father's drastic actions. He found himself talking aloud to himself, or even to the ancient, towering pines, wrestling with his identity, shedding layers of his former self with each passing hour. This period of intense solitude, designed to break down his remaining resistance, pushed him past mere survival skills to a new level of mental and emotional resilience. During this crucible of solitude, Ethan faced a critical challenge that pushed him to his absolute limit. While foraging deeper than usual, he suffered a significant injury, a deep gash on his leg from a jagged rock, leaving him genuinely desperate and in potential peril. The pain was searing, and the thought of infection loomed large. In a moment of extreme vulnerability and fear, his mind racing for a solution, he remembered Ilara's subtle lessons about emergency communication. He managed to craft a crude, coded message, etching symbols of distress and his approximate location into a thin piece of birch bark. He carefully tied it to the leg of a homing pigeon he had managed to capture, a method Ilara had mentioned for desperate times. This message wasn't a plea for rescue. It was a coded signal, a testament to his newfound ingenuity and a desperate hope for connection with his father, proving he was still fighting. But fate, guided by a sinister hand, intervened. Marcus Thorne, having placed sophisticated surveillance in the area, the very equipment Ethan had stumbled upon earlier, intercepted the pigeon. Thorne's operatives, trained to recognize unusual activity, brought the bird and its message directly to him. Thorne, seeing an opportune moment to deliver a final, crushing blow, manipulated the message. He twisted its meaning, adding fabricated details to make it sound as if Ethan was completely broken, begging to be rescued and utterly failing the challenge. The doctored message painted a picture of a spoiled boy utterly defeated, not a resilient young man fighting for survival. This act of profound injustice deepened the misunderstanding between father and son, further isolating Arthur and making him doubt Ethan's ability to ever change, while simultaneously fueling Thorne's narrative of Arthur's failing judgment. With Ethan's manipulated distress signal in hand, Marcus Thorne escalated his corporate coup. He presented the doctored evidence to Arthur, alongside a meticulously fabricated report detailing Sterling Industries' plummeting stock prices and irreversible market losses, all attributed to Arthur's distraction and unstable leadership. Thorne used the proof of Ethan's complete breakdown as the final nail in the coffin, arguing that Arthur's judgment was compromised, both as a father and as a CEO. He called for an emergency board meeting, presenting a motion for a vote of no confidence, positioning himself as the only one capable of stabilizing the company. The injustice was stark. Arthur, heartbroken by the supposed failure of his son and overwhelmed by the corporate crisis, was blindsided and emotionally vulnerable. He felt immense guilt, believing he had failed Ethan and now, potentially, his life's work. The tension was palpable as Arthur fought a losing battle, his once unshakable authority crumbling under Thorne's ruthless assault. Just as Ethan began to feel utterly defeated by his perceived abandonment and the crushing weight of solitude, a silent figure appeared by his flickering campfire. Old Man Silas. Silas was a man of the forest, his presence as natural and unassuming as the ancient trees around them. Their initial interaction was minimal, Silas simply appearing, his eyes holding a profound, knowing gaze. Silas didn't offer practical survival tips like Alara. Instead, he spoke in cryptic advice, parables about the interconnectedness of nature and the importance of inner strength. He shared stories of the forest's history, its incredible resilience, and the subtle lessons it taught to those who truly listened. Silas didn't judge Ethan's past, but observed his present struggles with a quiet wisdom. He taught Ethan about reading the deeper signs of the forest, not just for survival, but for understanding its spirit, its enduring patience. Through Silas, Ethan began to grasp the profound beauty and wisdom of the wilderness, realizing it was not just a place of hardship, but also a source of peace, profound learning, and spiritual renewal. This encounter provided Ethan with a much-needed spiritual and emotional anchor, helping him process his internal conflicts and giving him a new perspective on his journey, preparing him for the larger challenges ahead. Empowered by Silas's wisdom and his own growing intuition, Ethan revisited the area where he had found the suspicious equipment weeks earlier. This time, his enhanced tracking and observation skills allowed him to delve deeper, to see what he had previously missed. He uncovered a hidden camouflaged outpost, a crude but well-equipped cabin tucked away behind a waterfall, containing sophisticated surveillance gear, corporate documents emblazoned with Sterling Industries logos, and detailed plans for illegal resource extraction within the preserve. The shock that coursed through him was electrifying. He realized with a jolt of horror that the illegal activities in the woods were not random, but directly orchestrated by Marcus Thorne. He found damning evidence connecting Thorne to the environmental damage, the pervasive surveillance, and most damningly, a plot to exploit the preserve's rich timber and mineral resources as a means to fund his corporate takeover. The stakes instantly skyrocketed. His personal survival journey transformed into a desperate mission to expose Thorne and save his father's legacy and the very wilderness that had transformed him. The injustice was now multi-layered. Not only was his father being betrayed, but the pristine nature that had become his sanctuary was also under grave threat. This revelation ignited a fierce determination in Ethan, transforming him from a reluctant survivor into a proactive protector. With the shocking discovery of Thorne's treachery, Ethan's mission took on a new, urgent dimension. He realized he wasn't just fighting for his own transformation, but for his father's company and the integrity of the Whispering Pines Preserve. He now faced multiple, almost insurmountable obstacles. First, he needed irrefutable proof of Thorne's activities, something that couldn't be dismissed. Second, he needed a way to communicate this proof to his father, who was completely cut off from him and under Thorne's insidious influence. Third, he had to navigate the dangerous terrain, avoiding Thorne's operatives who were now actively monitoring the area, their presence a constant, chilling reminder of the danger. He knew his father's scheduled visit was approaching, making time a critical, rapidly dwindling factor. Ethan's internal conflict shifted from self-pity to a fierce sense of purpose. He devised a plan, combining his newfound survival skills with a strategic mind he didn't know he possessed. He enlisted Ilara's help, sharing his findings, and her initial skepticism turned into grim determination as she recognized the grave threat to her home and community. "My family lost land to men like Thorn before," she told him, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "This won't happen again." Old Man Silas, with a quiet nod, pledged his support as well. This unlikely alliance, forged in the heart of the wilderness, set the stage for a dramatic confrontation. The day of Arthur's scheduled visit arrived, fraught with tension. Arthur, weary and burdened by the corporate struggles and his son's perceived failure, arrived at the designated meeting point in the wilderness, a small, secluded clearing by a winding creek. He expected to find a broken, defeated Ethan, perhaps even to be forced to rescue him. Instead, through the dappled sunlight, he saw a leaner, more resilient figure, his movements fluid, his eyes sharp. But their reunion was immediately complicated by Thorn's machinations. Thorn, aware of Arthur's visit, had orchestrated a situation to prevent any meaningful interaction. As Ethan, his heart pounding, began to approach his father, a sudden, controlled explosion echoed from a distant part of the preserve, a diversion set by Thorn's men. Arthur's comms crackled with reports of an unforeseen environmental hazard requiring his immediate attention. Arthur almost saw the irrefutable evidence of Thorn's treachery that Ethan had painstakingly gathered, hidden in a hollow log near the meeting point. He almost witnessed Ethan's profound transformation as Ethan, reacting instantly to the distant blast, moved with a primal grace to assess the situation. But Thorn's swift, cunning interference created a critical misunderstanding. Arthur, believing the explosion to be a genuine threat and convinced Ethan was still the same reckless boy, was pulled away by his security detail. His face etched with deeper disappointment. He left, more convinced than ever that Ethan had failed and that his company was slipping away. Ethan was left with a crushing sense of injustice and despair. His efforts seemingly in vain, the weight of his father's disappointment heavier than ever. After the devastating near miss with his father, Ethan was at his lowest point, the taste of bitter defeat in his mouth. But Ilara and Old Man Silas refused to let him give up. Ilara, her eyes burning with fierce resolve, reminded him of the stakes. "This isn't just about your father's company, Ethan," she said, her voice low. "It's about this land and the people who depend on it. My family, our history, it's all tied to this preserve." Her revelation deepened her character and added another layer of emotional stakes to their fight. The three of them, Ethan, Ilara, and Silas, formed an unlikely but formidable alliance.